Oh, hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay there. One or two technical problems, a few gremlins in the studio, but here we are. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. And by the way, we're closing in on 80 shows. 80 shows. And remember, there's only 100 shows over 2 years, so we've been running for all that time. Thanks to you, because you are our loyal audience. You are who we are here for every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We learned that the former Labour Minister, Tom Harris, has been appointed lead Ned. He's the top Ned, apparently, at the Tory Scotland office. That's a non-executive director. In other words, he's sort of told what to do by other directors who happen to be executives. It's like a desperate soccer player trying to get a game. You know, some players just find it so very easy to swap teams. This is in a week when a Tory, rejected by the Scottish voters, found himself in the House of Lords. What a wonderfully undemocratic state we are in. And don't forget, you, all your friends, and your family are paying for this pantomime. If it wasn't so god-awful, it would be funny. See, thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we are talking to journalist and author Jackie Kemp. Jackie, of course, comes from an illustrious family of journalists, and we'll be discussing her views on the Tory government, what she thinks of Brexit and Nicola Sturgeon, why she favours independence, and we'll be talking about COP26 and so much more besides. And as always, as our guest, she is taking your questions live. Now, if you want to submit questions or comments, details are on the What's On guide at whatsonguide.scot. So, The Nation Talks is very much your show. We're live and we're free, so no license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks to Jackie Kemp. How are you, Jackie? How has COVID affected and the pandemic affected you?
Well, personally, I'm thankful to say it hasn't really, but it did obviously cause me kind of a lot of anxiety. And I think when I look back to the beginning of this whole thing, I remember how very anxious we all were because we were going into the unknown, weren't we? I think we're adjusting now to a state where COVID is sort of part of our lives, but it was very, very, very scary, really, I think. And it's good to remember that, actually.
Yeah,
I feel like I have a lot of conversations with people who go, "Oh, I had such a lovely lockdown; it was great," and I'm like, "No, it wasn't. You were, you were on the phone twice a week saying you can sleep." But we're all nostalgic now.
It's probably a safety mechanism that we all have, which is a sort of slightly sort of fragmented memory when it comes to certain things.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about your background. And you obviously, I said you came from an illustrious family of journalists. You do. You might want to talk about that and tell us a little bit about that, and also the time you spent in Boston.
Yes. Well, my father was Arnold Kemp, who we lost 10 years ago, and he was much longer ago than that. He was the editor of the Herald for about 14 years. And he was a brilliant journalist who really knew and cared passionately about Scotland, and he knew an awful lot about Scotland's politics, history, and culture. But he also had a very international outlook. He was a real Europhile. He spoke French and German. He read Le Monde. He loved Europe, and he was a big believer in the importance of the European Union. And I think he was part of that post-war generation who, perhaps he was like a little young to be part of rebuilding the institutions of democracy in Germany, but he felt that was the real achievement of the post-war generation in Europe. And, he loved the European Union, and he was very happy to see Scotland take its place there. And he was also a big supporter of Scottish devolution, and I think he would have been a supporter of independence. I mean, I was not a supporter in 2014, and I was just concerned. I didn't think Scotland was ready. I felt it was there wasn't enough support. I think Scotland's been building towards independence for a long time. And when I look back at my dad's writing, you know, when he wrote about those early days of the SNP, when there was an election, I think, was it 1974, where they'd won a lot of seats and then they lost them all except for one. And there's a passage in his book, The Hollow Drum, where he's talking to people about that night when the results came in and they realised that they kind of lost all except, I think, the Western Isles was the one that they kept. And I think it's been a question of the movement towards Scottish independence has been underway for a long time, and it's just been growing, but it tends to go in waves, doesn't it? It kind of grows, it falls back a little, it grows, it falls back a little, and every time it's been a bigger wave. And I think, you know, I heard a rumor that polling that Gove was trying to suppress before the last election showed 60% support for independence. I see it's fallen back a bit, and I'm not surprised really, because Brexit, COVID, it's all a very unstable time, and I you know, I'm not surprised that people are a bit less gung-ho about more change than they were. But yeah, so my dad and his father, Robert Kemp, was a playwright, and he was also, he wrote in Scots, and one of the things I'd love to do is retrieve a radio show that he did in 1950 called The Good Scots Tongue, and the manuscripts are in the National Library of Scotland. I don't think the recordings exist, but I'd love to go and kind of get some of that material out and put it back in the public domain, because he was very, very knowledgeable about Scotland, language, culture, history, and so on.
Do you know Billy Kay?
I don't know him, no.
Oh,
but he's a Scots. I mean, I think I might have come across him. He's a Scots.
Yeah, he's written the Mither Tongue, and he's been on the show, and also his good lady wife, Joao. Great shows, because he talked about growing up in Ayrshire and how that influenced his take on things and how he travelled the world, and so I think you might find what he has to say very interesting.
I'll listen back to that one, because I am really interested in that, and I think it's you know, it connects us to a whole part of Scottish history and culture that we're a bit separated from. You know, I suppose after the Union of the Crowns, when Scotland lost the patronage and power of the royal court, you know, there ceased to be as much literature and poetry written in Scots, and then it became quite fragmented, and people have made various efforts over the years to sort of pull it together and you know, restore it in some way.
Yeah, it sort of stems a little bit from the political system. I mean, we had James Hawes on the show a couple of 3 weeks ago, and the way he describes it in his shortest history of England is that, for example, if you take any of the medieval battles, including Bannockburn, the two leaders both spoke French, but none of the troops did.
Right. No.
And in England, this carried on for centuries, which because the hierarchy, the nobility, saw no reason to communicate directly.
Well, Scott dramatised that, didn't he? And Ivanhoe set in that kind of Saxon Norman battle.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about Boston. How did you end up in Boston, Massachusetts?
Well, my husband got the opportunity to move to Boston, and actually he was commuting to London at the time. He was a Willie, works in London, lives in Edinburgh, and for years, and then, you know, the kids were getting older, and I just said, well, I'd rather actually go somewhere else. I've kind of done London. I don't really want to go there again. And so he got the opportunity to go to Boston, and we were there. He was there for 4 years, and I was sort of here and there, but I was definitely there for a couple of years. And it was great. It was really interesting living outside Scotland for a while, outside Britain for a while. And America is such a huge, huge country. I think that's the big thing I sort of took away from it. It's just massive, massive. And then to Americans, Europe seems all kind of like crammed together. They're all, you know, you're all a bit, you know, close together over there, aren't you? And the idea that it's all different countries and different languages it just seems weird to them, I think.
Yeah.
It's just there's so much history here.
Yeah,
It's just complexities.
I lived in Minnesota for a year or so, and in the Midwest, and it was very different. I mean, nobody there knew anything about Scotland. I mean, literally didn't know anything. No. I was having my
and why would they? I mean, why would they really? I just used to say I come from Northern Europe.
Yeah.
Because why should they? I mean, I think the other thing I love about it is that they don't care. You just drop. You can become an American so easily. Really, you can just drop, because it's like everyone comes from somewhere where they drink too much and do folk dancing, and it's just like that's it. Nobody's really interested in where it was, or I mean, they're kind of interested in a social way, but you can be an American. It's an accessible identity, and people don't say, where are you from? Because it's kind of a rude question. They might say, where did you grow up? Or, what's your ethnicity or something like that. Maybe what's your ethnicity is not the right way of asking, but they do love to chit chat about their roots in a social way, but they do have a more accessible identity, I think. That's it's a country of immigrants, really. And one of my memories of Boston is seeing this Black American Muslim woman with a, headscarf thing, hijab on, walking through the garden in Boston, and there was these volunteer gardeners, and she stopped. She went, "Thank you," and you're volunteering, and they were like, "Yay!" And it's just like I couldn't imagine a European Muslim stopping to thank some like white working class guys for doing some gardening. It just was really nice that she felt confident enough. I think American women are also quite they're quite sort of bold and sort of free in their ways, more than we are, I think, really. They think nothing of going into a bar on their own and sitting and having dinner. In American bars, there's a center bar and the bartender stands in the middle. So if you go in on your own, like you're traveling for work or something, you just sit up at the bar, and then you get a chat with the bartender, and someone else might sit there and talk to you. So it's quite free and easy, really, in lots of ways.
Apart from the guns.
Well, yeah, guns, scary, very scary. We went camping one time, and nobody does this, but we went camping without a car. We got dropped off at this campsite, and we had two little tents. My husband and I had two little tents, and he said, "Oh, you have the food in your one," and I was like, "What about the bears?" He's like, "There's no bears here." And then I heard this rustling in the night because we'd arrived late, and when I got up, there was a sign saying, "Beware of the bears." So that was the first thing that happened, and then we had to trudge to the bus station, and there was on a Sunday morning there was this crack of gunfire, and there was people just firing guns in a field, and my husband walked past. I was like, I'm not walking past them, I'll find my own way. So I sort of trudged my own way to the bus station, but it was really scary. I mean, it's just scary having people walking about with guns.
Well, I'll tell you my story about guns. My son and I were on vacation in Florida, and he said, "I've never fired a gun." I said, "Well, there's a shooting gallery nearby. We can go there." We walked in. Picture the scene: the two of us with funny accents, and we're standing there in front of this woman on her own with a till, and she said, "What sort of guns do you want?" And I thought, well, I'm stumped because I have no idea what gun I want, since I don't have any background or familiarity. So my son was equal to the occasion, and he named some firearm. She said, "Well," I said, "We'll have two of those." This is what she did. On her own, in front of the till, she handed us two weapons, complete stranger, and said, "But you'll need some ammunition." She got two boxes of shells and pushed them across the counter. And I'm looking at the shells and I'm looking at the gun. I'm thinking, I don't know quite how this, I've seen it in the movies, but I don't know how. She said, "Oh, would you like me to show you how to load it?" I said, "Sure." So I handed the gun back to her. She then took out some shells and put them in the chambers, and then handed me the loaded gun and said, "That'll be $20. I just found the whole thing bizarre. Absolutely.
I know, you go into Dick's Sporting Goods and there's a bunch of guns there. But in some parts of New England, people do actually hunt. Like we were in Vermont, and Vermont went down, at some point it went down to 20% tree cover, but it's now back up to 80% tree cover. So it's basically just a huge forest. And one of the ways that they raised the money was through taxing hunting gear. But people who live there, a lot of them just don't have a lot of money. There's not a lot of work. And, we got in a taxi one night, and, our taxi driver was telling us that he shot bear, but they weren't always very nice to eat. It depends on what the bear's been eating. But you just go into the woods and shoot a bear and then drag it back, gut it where it found it. And then it's illegal. They're not supposed to shoot bear. And then drag it back to his trunk of his car, and then they just eat bear. It's like you run out of money. But Russia's like that as well. I lived in Russia for a little while, and people in Russia, they've sort of had to live in a country where things that we take for granted, like the currency, they sometimes collapse. Like it did collapse in the 90s, and people have got these systems. Everyone's got a dacha, and you just go back to the dacha and bottle fruit and live on that. You have to. It's not obviously it's not what people want, but yeah, I think Russia and America are quite similar in some ways. Yeah.
We've had some questions. Well, I'd like to take a question from Hashbury, who is asking, could Jackie comment on the ownership of the mainstream media, and has she had any difficulties working with any editors?
Yeah, well, I'm not really a journalist anymore. I kind of work. I produce sort of business content, but yeah, I think the ownership of the media. I wrote a piece recently, I think, which you commented on, asking if Scotland has the most hostile domestic media in the world, and I think the ownership structure I think that the newspapers still really set the agenda. Broadcasters look at the papers, at the newsstands every morning. So even though not that many people probably read newspapers, they're still important. And a lot of them are, very right-wing, or they're owned by, global conglomerates or unionist organizations. We don't have anything like, say, the Irish Times, which is a trust, which, is a really fantastic paper with some great writers and serves its readership very well. I mean, we do have, I think the National's great, the Herald and the Scotsman do have all of these outlets, Times, all of them, they've all got really good journalists and really good writers, but they don't always have a lot of autonomy about what they cover. They really don't. And that's one reason I don't work for newspapers anymore. So I don't like that, the way that you just don't have any control over what happens to your content.
Well, I assume that newspapers work the same way that every other organ does. Any company, the person in charge decides what the line is and decides what content is appropriate.
It's not really not like they design what the line is. It's like news sense. It's like people have this idea of, oh, this is news or that's news, but it's not kind of written down or articulated. And their sense of what news is very much governed by what other people think is news. So you might present a story to a news editor and they might go, oh, and I've read that story a million times. And then the same story might be on the front page of another paper, and they're like, why didn't we have that? And you'd be like, well, you didn't think it was news. But so I think it's all unspoken and not really articulated. But the decision is we were talking earlier in the warm-up about BBC Scotland, and it's the fact that they just have no autonomy. They don't have any ability to take their own decisions, really. It's a very hierarchical organisation. It is a unionist organisation. The people at the top are now kind of Tory placemen. So I think, you do have great journalists working for the BBC, but, they might, they just don't have any control, over what they produce.
I think you said, if I recall right, BBC Scotland's output is determined by 3 people based in London, perhaps.
Well, I'm sure it's not quite as, but yeah, people become frightened as well when people work in such a hierarchical organisation. They kind of second guess because they want to be liked by their boss. They want to get the pay rise. They want to get the good jobs. So there's a lot of organizational bias that kind of creeps in, and there's a lot of work being done on that in business, that most people are really quite deferential, And when you put them in a situation where someone can hire and fire them, they really try to please. And that's what happens. But there have been plane crashes where the plane crash happened because the co-pilot couldn't bring themselves to tell the captain that they were running out of fuel. That has happened.
Absolutely, and it's what happens when organizations in management speak become ossified. They are incapable of understanding that they're about to crash, even though they get lots of warnings to that effect, because they don't understand the warnings. They assume that.
But they can't respond. Yeah, it's hard for a hierarchical organization to respond because I read this really good book about what happened at Nokia. And so that was terrible because they had this great business. Remember Nokia phones? Everyone had them. And they were such terrific handsets. You could throw them down a well, you could drive your Land Rover over them and they would still work. So they were going down this handset route, but nobody told the bosses that the operating system was completely hosed. So it was taking them days and days to run tests because it was all totally jammed up. And then, an iPhone came along and stole all their business, even though their handsets were kind of rubbish. They crack all the time.
Yeah.
But but nobody wanted to tell the board, so the board just had no idea.
Yeah.
Everyone was just hiding it from them.
Having spent most of my life in business, and I recognize that in so many respects. If you have an organization where people are overly deferential for whatever reason, either you threaten them that they'll take away, you make it impossible for them to pay their mortgage or whatever, then you don't get that absolutely essential information that tells you. It's a bit like being the captain of the Titanic. You're heading for the iceberg. Everyone else sees it. You're not aware of it. They could tell you, but they decide not to because they're very concerned about their futures. What tends to happen is exactly what happened to the Titanic. The whole structure just hits the iceberg or whatever it is in the way. It wasn't as if it was an accident. It wasn't as if it was, in the case of Titanic, obviously, but it was. But generally, there's people there who've seen it, have acknowledged it, have actually spoken up, and the organization says, it's that troublemaker in number 4 again.
Yeah.
Just ignore it.
We were talking about the Agile Manifesto earlier. In technology, there's this thing called the Agile Manifesto, which came out of software construction. And it was a bit like, no, don't let someone write you a really long spec and then you go to an ivory tower for 4 years and you come out having built the thing they asked for. And they're like, oh, we don't want that now. Everything changed when you were away making it. So the Agile Manifesto is very much about being responsive to change. You don't know why your customers need to change, but they've changed. So be positive about it. Just work with the reality and don't try to be perfect. Just deliver value and then hone it and just work with people to kind of be constructive. So I think that the Agile, I love the Agile Manifesto. I think it's just got so much fantastic stuff in it. But there's also this thing about avoiding crisis, working fast, but sustainably, because you've got this rhythm, which means that you can kind of keep going without constant crises, because crises are exhausting. So if you can have a situation, and we're seeing that with the NHS, I feel so sorry. When you asked me about COVID, I was thinking, I bumped into a friend of mine who's a nurse in the street yesterday, and she was just saying things are really bad. They're really, really short of staff, and it's just, these are tough women who work with life and death every day, but they're struggling, and that's a big problem. So we need to find a way of working, trying to create an NHS which isn't so crisis prone, and it's just crisis piled upon crisis, like the Brexit and COVID and all that, So I'm slightly digressing from what we started to talk about, but really I think it's about trying to work with the people on the ground because they know what's going on. They know what's going on. And if you create a culture where they're too scared to tell you, it's not good.
Well, there are books on corporate disaster and the libraries are full of them and nobody reads them. But essentially, they all have the same message, which is exactly what you just said. There's loads of people in the organization can see the iceberg, but nobody wants to tell the captain or the senior.
Well, they are. I mean, people in the NHS are saying there's an iceberg. They're saying all the time, they're shouting, look, there's an iceberg. And we've been telling you about it for months. But there's no easy solution, is there? If there was an easy solution, we would have it,
Well, there are forms of solution, but I think it rather suits Westminster's agenda that the NHS is in crisis, because if you're going to sell something off, you have to get public approval. And the best way to get public approval is to run something down or put it under such enormous stress that you can pursue the line that, oh, it's not working, we need private capital to sustain it. And therefore, we should sell off bits and pieces of it. Private capital is not interested in the bits that most people want. They want to cherry pick and choose those bits which are actually going to make the most profit. That's the fundamental reality.
Well, I mean, that's quite a cynical view, but I think that there has been an issue with underinvestment, but probably I think it actually is in crisis, and I think one of the reasons for that is social care. They really, Brexit is part of it. They really couldn't afford to lose like 7-8% of their staff. They couldn't afford to lose it. Scotland's got an aging population. Nicola Sturgeon has been talking about how Scotland remains friendly to Europeans, but I don't know that that's really cutting through, because people have reasons for not wanting to come back. It's not easy to attract people to Scotland to do these jobs. So we don't have the people on the ground to do social care. And if you don't have the social care staff, the care homes can't take people in, the hospitals fill up with people who can't be discharged. So I think there's a number of issues. And I mean, I suppose to a certain extent, there's technology. We can look, people talk about technology as if it's like a magic thing, but there are ways to support people to make I think to give people some sort of autonomy. I think I was talking to someone about social care, and they were saying actually people have to do quite a lot of paperwork, which takes up time. It's annoying. Can we give them, the latest iPhone when they join and say, if you stay for 6 months, you can keep it. And that actually might make their jobs a bit easier, because they've got a way of registering automatically where they are, what they're doing, without having to, so they're probably, we probably need to be quite creative about trying to solve some of these problems. I don't know what the answers are, but I certainly think that your analogy about the iceberg is, well, they know there's an iceberg.
You mentioned Nicola Sturgeon earlier. What do you think of her performance?
I think she's great. I have huge admiration for Nicola Sturgeon. And I think she's doing a fantastic job. It's a tough job. It must be. It's been very tough for the last couple of years. People have been saying, oh, she's tired. I'm sure she probably is, but I think, she's probably, probably lots of people are tired, not just Nicola Sturgeon, like my friend, the nurse. So I think, it has been a tough time, and I don't think it will go back to normal. The new normal is a bit of a cliche, but I don't think we can easily see what's going to happen next. Obviously nobody's got a crystal ball, but there are lots of issues, aren't there? There's the NHS, there's the energy crisis, which is there's inflation, there's interest rates going up. So I was talking to a client today who's like a data person, and I was talking to him about this issue, because if interest rates go up 0.5% by the end of the year, which they may do, everybody all public sector employees, unless they get a big pay rise, which they're not going to get, they're going to be struggling to pay their mortgages. So we were saying, why can't the banks just kind of reach out to those people and say, because obviously the banks know what's going to happen with interest rates more than busy public sector employees. Can they not reach out to them and say, like, do you want to restructure your loan or move to a slightly different package in advance, like to limit the stress that people are going to experience by worrying about all that and having to sit on the phone to the mortgage companies? And, last time there was a financial crash, a lot of people ended up in real trouble, so.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's it's not rocket science that banking is based on shifting the product, which is loans in large part. And so therefore, there's no real incentive for the banks to care in that way. Their incentive is to say, here's some money, which is pretty much what's happening just now. You could swap your present mortgage for one with a lower interest rate. Does that attract you? We need a bit more deposit from you, stuff like that. That's where the pressure goes. It doesn't go.
Yeah, no, I think the advantage for the banks in kind of managing this more effectively is that they avoid stress for everybody. They avoid default, and they avoid they keep customers' loyalty for longer. So I think there are business cases for looking after your customers, building a lot of business today is really not so much based on getting new customers. It's actually based on looking after your existing customers and keeping those relationships, and maybe, adding to the services you provide for your customer. They shop in the supermarket, they could also bank with you, and maybe you can, sell them pet insurance, and, so it's more about, so I think there is a business case definitely for managing that. But yeah, so that's another, and then there's the energy crisis, all these companies going bust. So there are lots of, there's a lot of unpredictability. There's an awful lot of unpredictability, and that's where the Agile Manifesto comes in, because it's about knowing what's happening so that you can respond more effectively and more quickly, and it's also about letting people throughout your organization make decisions, because they know what's happening and they're trusted to decide, what to do.
Okay, that sounds good. COP26. Tell us what you think of COP26.
Oh, I'm a bit worried about it. I really hope it's a success, but I fear that there's a possibility that it could be a shambles. I don't know what's going to happen with this train strike and the bus. I hope that's averted, because it doesn't take all that much to create gridlock, does it, on the M8?
That's true. But I guess a lot of the people going, some of them perhaps, certainly the executives, will have their own private arrangements.
How will they? I mean, what do you mean? How can they put private arrangements? They're staying in Edinburgh. They're attending COP26.
Take a helicopter from your Edinburgh hotel. I mean, that's what happens. Yeah. You have to be a fan of Succession to see what goes on there.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Everybody has to share the infrastructure that exists when it comes to transport, really.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how expensive your car is, but if the M8 is gridlocked, you'll not be going anywhere very fast. But I hope this. I mean, and I totally understand the rail union's point of view, because I heard the guy on the radio talking about they don't want to give up their conditions in order to get a pay rise. It seems fair enough, and I don't even understand, because I think the provider, Abellio, I think they're going to leave anyway in a year. So it just seems, I don't know.
What that tells us is they have no incentive to fix the problem, because they're leaving.
Yeah, they have no incentive. But I don't. Yeah, I mean, but what is Nicola Sturgeon's role in COP26? Because there was a little while ago, there was all this like, oh, Boris isn't going to let Nicola do anything at COP26. What's happening with that?
I was hoping you might tell us, because as far as I can gather, the last news I heard was that various senior business people were saying that the Cabinet Office arrangements were shambolic. And it was the Cabinet Office is running this. I mean, it happens to be taking place in Glasgow, but the whole thing is being run out of the Cabinet Office, which is why Boris Johnson could make that remark that he doesn't want Nicola Sturgeon to be anywhere near it, which is what he said to various party members at one stage, famously. Now, I think he'll probably soften his approach a little bit, but it won't be terribly much. He won't want to grandstand, I would imagine. Oops.
Sorry, I've got someone's phoning me. Hang on.
So I think, but will you be covering it for your newsletter?
Well, I'm hosting, so I volunteered to host someone on the Human Hotel, because there's trouble. People are having trouble finding accommodations. You might have seen in the papers. It's like £30,000 for a one-bed flat in Finiston. So anyway, I'm hosting a Tanzanian environmentalist for a week. So that'd be interesting, and I am interested in it, and I hope that I mean, there have been so many promises over what governments are going to do, and I was reading today in the FT, they had a column by the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who was sort of saying that, relatively small amounts of money were promised to help developing countries to deal with this, but very little of that money has materialized. And I would like to see at least some real commitment to helping developing countries to do what they need to do to kind of jump over some of the dirty tech that developed countries used on the way to industrializing. I hope they can find better solutions. And I don't know. What do you think will happen? Do you think there'll be a Glasgow agreement?
Well, I think there'll be a form of agreement. These things are usually decided in advance anyway. And the actual meeting, sometimes, I'm not saying that that's the case now, but in cases in the past, there's been theatre, which is that the principals all turn up and get their photo shots and all the rest of it. But the Sherpas, so-called, who represent these groups, have agreed in advance what they're going to say. But we've just had someone, Jim McIntyre, say he thinks that COP26 is now a dead duck because Putin has announced today he won't be attending.
Well, I never thought Putin would come, really. I mean, I'd have been surprised. But yeah, it just kind of feels like, everything, it just sort of feels like the ducks aren't in a row, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It feels like the ducks are definitely not in a row. So it might, yeah.
Maybe Greta Thunberg will get them all into line. Oh, I should point out, by the way, Kevin, our producer, has posted the fact that there's a big march and rally on the 6th of November, and it's been run by the COP26 coalition. And I gather there's a section in the march for indie supporters. So if there's anyone out there who feels strongly, then there's a place for you, it looks like, to march.
Scotland has made some definite advances. I think I was reading in the paper that in 2011, something like about a third of electricity was powered by renewables, and now it's 97%. So Scotland is definitely making progress, and I think it is good to kind of recognise that. I know it's not enough, but there is good stuff happening, and there are incredible projects. People are coming up with really amazing ideas about how to do things differently and how to do things better. So I hope we can sort of build on that.
I'd like to think that too. I mean, there's a general acknowledgement, particularly when it comes to these matters, that small is beautiful, and that you can get enough people together to point roughly in the same direction to get change implemented. If you look at the countries that have done best, they're generally not the huge blocks. China's still churning out coal-fired power stations and stuff, which doesn't, on the face of it, must make sense to them economically. It doesn't necessarily make a great deal of sense environmentally. And the UK government is talking increasingly about a role for nuclear power. Go figure, as they say. Tell us a little bit about your newsletter, Jackie. There'll be people watching and listening tonight who might want to plug into what you're saying and doing. How do they get in touch with you? Where do they get your newsletter? Where is it printed? Where is it available?
Oh, it's a sort of email thing. I do a Substack newsletter. So if you just kind of Google Jackie Kemp Substack, you'll find it. So Substack's this platform where quite a lot of people in the States, like Heather Cox Richardson, this terrific historian, write newsletters, and then you just sign up. It's free. You can just sign up, put your email address on it, and then when I write one, which is once a week, it will appear in your email inbox, and then you can either read it or not as you choose. But it's a kind of a hobby. I probably just as soon do that as watch telly. I write one about once a week, and they range from sort of politics to culture. It's called A Letter from Scotland, and some of the people that subscribe are friends and family who live on other overseas, and they're maybe quite interested in. Quite often end up writing about UK politics, because I think it's really hard for the Scottish government to they have limited powers which are already under attack from Westminster, and it's just really hard for them to do the kind of things that we would like to see happening in Scotland.
Could I just mention, by the way,
Brexit, COVID,
Yeah, actually, I agree with that. Could I just mention, for the benefit of everyone watching and listening, that Jackie's newsletter on Substack on September 15, it's called A Letter from Scotland. It's headlined, "Does the Scottish Government face the most hostile domestic media in the world?" So a number of you have been asking questions about the mainstream media. I would direct you to Jackie's article in Letter from Scotland, September 15, on Substack.
I think it probably does. I mean, I can't think of another country where all of the media, virtually all of the media, is kind of owned and operated from another country. And, it is incredibly hostile, really, I think. Even The Guardian, you would expect The Guardian to be quite sort of supportive of some of the progressive ideas that, the government has, or that people here are trying to enact. But, it's quite hostile, really. I think that's going to shift. And I think, I think over time it will have to shift, really, because I think, as the case for independence builds, and as, that, I don't know, maybe it won't, maybe it won't change. I don't know. It's hard to tell. It's great having the National anyway, because that really does, it's great to see that on the newsstands.
Yeah. Again, Kevin, our producer, is pointing out that he's running your website address on the screen as we speak. So folks who want to plug in can go right there. And also, I need to say that Anita King has commented that Putin is going to be there on video link, according to the news. So that's a positive thing. I mean, it's not as if he's sitting back there in the Kremlin saying, "I want nothing to do with this." I think anyway that would be a disastrous thing to take, position to take. But he's obviously going to be involved in some way, shape, or form, which is good. And maybe he feels that with the pandemic, it's maybe not the right time to be travelling. I'm sort of making excuses for him now. Maybe I shouldn't.
Well, I mean, I think it's a global problem. The problem's not going to go away. Whatever Glasgow does, it's not going to fix it. It's just one step on the road, isn't it? It's all these conversations, all these thinking about, different ways of addressing the problem. It's a long road, really. Well,
if it helps people, let me just say that we have Julian Caldecott on the show on the 10th of November. And Julian is an ecologist, and he takes a somewhat pessimistic view about the prospects, not just for COP26, but also generally speaking about the attitude of the major nations. And this might interest you, Jackie. He takes the view that an independent Scotland would be a significant asset to helping change minds across the world, which is fantastic. It's good to know. I did say earlier that small is beautiful, and that might turn out to be the case. So
I mean, I think at the end of the day, all of the people who sort of care about this, who are working on it, I think there's a tipping point, isn't there? We kind of reach you reach a tipping point, and I think that'll happen with Scottish independence, the tipping point. But what I was thinking about, what I was going to say about this, and it's like, I want Scottish independence because I want a Scotland that can thrive, where we can do great work on all these big issues. I don't see myself as a narrow nationalist. I'm kind of an internationalist, and I think Scottish independence is important because I kind of reject English nationalism and where they're headed. And I hope that we could sort of present some kind of positive things that people could, be part of, and taking all this seriously and making good stuff happen is really what it's all about,
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with you. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the small L's and why you think that may be a model for the future.
Well, I was just interested in the fact that they have these different, the four small L's all have different ownership structure, and Egg has community buyout, and they seem to be doing really well, population growing, planting all these trees, 19,000 trees that they've grown themselves. They're really engaging on a sort of ground level. I think Muck is owned by people who apparently live there. I don't know much about it, but they live there and they're part of the island life. But Cana and Rum are owned by kind of London-based Quangos, or the Scottish arms of London-based Quangos, and they both seem to be doing quite badly in terms of like population or initiatives. And I'm sure people are trying to make stuff happen, but it's just it's interesting. I actually said to Maxwell McLeod that he should write a book about it because he knows a lot about it. And he's been blogging on Facebook about Egg. But he said, I'd rather blow my nipples off with a blowtorch than add to the pile of boring books about the Hebrides, which I thought was kind of burn my nipples off with a blowtorch. But he knows a lot more about it than I do. But another friend of mine who's lived on Cana was saying that the house on Cana's got apparently one of the biggest collections anywhere of Gaelic manuscripts, but they don't do anything with them apart from like stamp National Trust for Scotland. I mean, that's probably, I don't know if that's true. I shouldn't even repeat an anecdote like that, I suppose, without checking it. But yeah, I think if you look at the population, lack of growth, and the fact that they're not really part of the same kinds of initiatives as Egg, it makes you again think about decision making, and it's probably because the decision making doesn't happen there because the people who work there work for people who work for people who work for people. And by the time three people in London who can make decisions, by the time one of them's found time to address it, the situation's changed.
We're back to the BBC again.
We're back to Agile again. yeah, we're back to Agile. Well, it's not just about BBC, it's about hierarchy. I don't really like hierarchy. I prefer to try to create situations where people can be autonomous as possible and take their own decisions. And I think that's what's so great about community ownership, is that ideally that's what that's about.
The whole world.
It doesn't always work.
Yeah, I agree. The whole world really is a conflict between centralization and decentralization. And my experience of large organizations is to go through these two phases. It's like every 5 years, somebody says, something, we ought to bring all these departments together in one spot and run the whole thing from there. We can get economies, we can bear down on costs. 5 years later, there's a new management team. They say, we need to decentralize because we're too far away from the customers. We really don't know what's going on because we're too close knit in this one place. So they decentralize. That lasts for 5 years, and they're back to another side.
Well, you're right. That there is a sort of constant tension, and you look at the USA, which is a kind of federation of states, and then the European Union, again facing that tension with Poland, which I think regards itself as the kind of Texas of the EU at the moment, sort of falling out with the EU over who gets to decide issues of law or human rights or whatever in Poland. And I think that there is always going to be tension, and there's and there are certain things like I saw a model for devolution. Apparently, Joe Grimond his argument for devolution was that the Scottish Parliament should have all the powers apart from the ones it gives to Westminster. And I think that's the kind of European model, isn't it? That power is really held by the 27 heads of state, they work together on some things, but they retain a lot of autonomy. So there's no kind of easy answer as to how these things work. Everybody's got to work together. We all have to pull together and try to make things like climate change, try to manage those things, and so there will have to be a degree of centralization at some points, I suppose. I don't know, but I think
there are obviously functions where centralization makes sense, but in my humble experience, there are precious few. Most of the time, it's best to decentralize by and large. As long as there's, I mean, the EU is a sort of decentralized operation with some central functions organized.
Yeah. So it's like who can regulate, who can force global companies to pay tax?
Yeah.
Only something like the EU.
Exactly. There's a notion that one of the reasons that Brexit was so popular amongst the right wing and the Conservative Party was that because the EU was planning to introduce legislation to control tax havens.
And GDPR, like who else could have done GDPR? And that's been sort of hated by a lot of tech companies, but it gives people a certain degree of privacy which you didn't have before. Sort of guaranteed privacy, and who's going to regulate AI and how algorithms are used? There is basically no regulation now, so that can't be. There has to be regulation. So I think that you get power. There are other powerful institutions. There are other powerful forces in the world. And so little people have to band together to kind of curb the power of these global companies.
Yeah, and you probably have to start off with a constitution that makes it plain that nobody's is able to ride roughshod on everyone else. Here's John Paul Warrilow asking, do you think that Greta Thunberg will recognise the work that Scotland is doing a bit for climate change? Because I don't think it's fair for anyone to say that we don't do enough.
Well, I think I think nobody's really doing enough. I mean, I think Greta Thunberg is very, she's really important because there are very few personalities like that who are talking to a global audience about environmentalism, and she is like this little person that's come to Earth to tell us, how we need to take this seriously. And I think she's great, and hats off to her and all the work she's done. And I think if you look at this, I watched a documentary the other night about the Arctic ice melting, and when you look at that, you think, well, we're not doing enough. Nobody's doing enough, and we do need to kind of not be defensive about that. We are doing good work, and things are happening, but I think it probably isn't enough. With the best will in the world, it's not enough.
We're running out of time. It's been very enjoyable and educational. Are there any last messages you'd like to give the audience? Is there anything that you feel we haven't covered tonight, but you feel strongly about it, or a couple of three things in the time we've got?
I think I'd really like to see people in the independence movement being really open to reaching out. Oh man,
that's your picture has gone again.
Yeah.
This
person keeps phoning me. Same person, I'm on my phone. Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of work together to build towards a future. And I don't think the independence referendum, I don't think there will be another one in this parliament. I don't see how that's going to happen, really. So probably the next set piece is going to be the Westminster election. And I think Boris Johnson and the Tories will try as hard as they can to kind of wrong foot everybody, but particularly probably the SNP. I don't know what they're planning, but they will be planning something. And one of the things that the right does in America very effectively is employs these wedge issues, which are, things like it was abortion, now it's this whole gender thing. I think we should just try and stay really calm about all of that and not angry, because anger is just like the engine. It's like artists, like contemporary artists, always look to be at the site of controversy because that's where the energy is. Like Damien Hirst is like a human skull crusted with diamonds, and it was called "Oh, for Christ's sake," because that's what his mum said when she saw it. And that's a brilliant piece of contemporary art, because it's just pitched at the site of controversy, and that's where you find those fault lines. That's where you find this energy. So just be aware that that anger's not really helpful. You know, a little bit of anger. Someone's quoting Queen's Gambit to me. A little bit of anger is a spice, but too much overwhelms your senses. You know, it's like don't. So I hope people don't allow themselves to become angry about things that, you know, possibly aren't as big an issue as. I mean, how many transgender people are there playing sport professionally in Scotland? Probably not even that many.
I wouldn't imagine
so. I mean, I don't come across it much, you know, myself. It's like that whole hijab thing. Remember years ago, everybody was worried about Muslim women wearing the hijab, and it was all over the Scottish news. And I was like, when did it wasn't the hijab, it's the niqab. It's like, when did I last see someone in Edinburgh wearing the niqab? I mean, I don't think I've ever seen it, you know. So why were we all getting so upset about it? And now we're all wearing face veils.
There's a terrible irony about that, isn't there?
I know. People got so het up about it.
Yeah. Well, these things come and they go, and sometimes they stick around. Who knows?
Yeah.
Society decides these things over a period of time.
My friends remind me about smoking when they banned smoking in pubs, I sort of got really worried. Everyone was like really worried that all the pubs were going to close. We're like, oh no, all the pubs are going to close. But now you're glad that they banned smoking in pubs.
Exactly. If they banned alcohol, that might be something different.
Yeah. See, I mean, probably some pubs did close, but you know, they didn't all close.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a joy to go into a pub without all the smoke. But I speak as a non-smoker, so heck.
No, but you know, you wouldn't. You go into a pub now and it was a fog of smoke. You would walk out.
Well, this has been great. Our hour is gone. 60 minutes has just flown. I'm very grateful to you, Jackie. If you could hang around for a little bit once we're all through, I'd be very grateful. So I want to register the fact that we're very much appreciative to Jackie for joining us tonight. I think it's been interesting, educational, and entertaining. A big thanks to Jackie, and a big thanks to all of you out there for joining us tonight. Sincerely, I hope you've enjoyed this TNT show. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests ahead for future shows. You know, this is the place for the big hitters, the people you don't see and don't appear on the sort of mainstream media, because the mainstream media isn't big enough to actually encompass the people who are actually saying things and doing things that are making a difference. That's their problem. We're here to fill that gap. We really appreciate you joining us every Wednesday. Please go to the Indie Live guide on www.whatsonguide.scot. And we're back next week at the same time with another special guest. We've got celebrated writer and broadcaster Marcus Chown. He's here next week. Oh, and as always, please look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. You'll find it in the 7-day supplement. And if you like it, tell the editor. Thanks again and good night. You know something? It's been a great day for British democracy. Listen to this. This thanks to Caledon Radio. We learn that while the UK has 0.87 of the world's population, it now has 20% of new COVID cases. My, you can scarcely blame President Putin for not wanting to come. Okay, to all of you, thanks for joining us. In the light of these figures I've just given you, please stay safe and take care. Good night. Thanks again for watching. See you next Wednesday at 7 p.m.